You think modern dating is a challenge? Imagine a world where marriage was a legally sanctioned nightmare that often began in childhood. We're not speaking of teenagers. We're talking about documented contracts signed by 6-year-old girls who brought their dolls to their own weddings. Upon saying "I do," a woman's legal identity was often erased. She became the property of a husband who, in many places, could legally beat her with a state-approved stick. The wedding night itself could be a public, ritualized humiliation, and every subsequent pregnancy was a potential death sentence, with a roughly 1 in 3 chance of dying in childbirth. For centuries, there was no escape, no annulment, no starting over. The only recognized divorce lawyer in the medieval world was death. But this system wasn't an accident. It was a carefully constructed pillar of society, blessed by the church and enforced by the state. How did these horrifying practices become normal? And why was the complete subjugation of women seen not as a bug, but as a feature of a stable Christian world? To understand, we must explore the laws, beliefs, and brutal realities that turned holy matrimony into a horror story. Let's start with the most twisted part of medieval marriage: the brides who brought their toys to their own weddings. Imagine being 6 years old. You can't read, you can't write, you probably still believe in magic. Now imagine signing a marriage contract that determines the fate of entire kingdoms. Today we debate whether 18 is too young for marriage. Medieval nobles were debating whether 6 was too old. What you're about to learn will fundamentally change how you view childhood, consent, and the word tradition. Isabella of Valois became Queen of England at the tender age of 6 years and 5 days old. The historical records are disturbing beyond comprehension. Witnesses describe how she played with her dolls during the actual wedding ceremony. Richard II, her husband, was 29 years old. Court documents reveal she brought miniature silver furniture to the wedding feast, setting it up on the high table while political alliances worth millions in today's money were being sealed with her name. One chronicler noted with disturbing casualness, "The little queen played with her toys while great matters of state were decided around her." But wait, it gets worse. The marriage contract included detailed clauses about when consummation would occur, discussing a child's future sexual availability with the same cold precision as livestock breeding. This wasn't seen as horrific. Contemporary accounts describe the wedding as joyous and blessed by God. The truly disturbing part comes with Margaret Beaufort, whose story would traumatize modern audiences. First married at age 6 to John de la Pole, the marriage was annulled for political reasons, not because anyone thought marrying a first grader was wrong. She was immediately remarried at age 12 to Edmund Tudor, who was 24 years old. Here's where the nightmare truly begins. Edmund didn't wait for her to mature. By age 12, Margaret was pregnant. The birth at age 13 nearly killed her. Witnesses described it as a miracle that a baby could be born of so little a personage. The trauma of giving birth at such a young age left her permanently damaged, unable to ever conceive again. But here's what makes your blood run cold. Her son from this traumatic birth would become King Henry VII. The entire Tudor dynasty, including Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, existed because a grown man impregnated a 12-year-old child, and society celebrated this as divine providence. The statistics paint a picture of systematic child exploitation that would constitute crimes against humanity today. The average noble girl was betrothed by age 7, with marriage contracts including dowry negotiations worth the modern equivalent of $500,000 or more. The church's official position stated girls could consent to marriage at 12 and boys at 14, but the reality was far more disturbing. Younger marriages were common with future consummation clauses that make your skin crawl. These contracts literally scheduled when it would be appropriate to begin sexual relations with children. One surviving contract from 1395 states with chilling precision: "The marriage shall be consummated when the bride achieves her 14th year, or when her body shows signs of womanly maturity, whichever comes first." Let me paint you the escalation pattern that shows how normalized this horror was. It started with betrothals, contractual agreements made when children were still in cradles. Parents would literally sign away their infant daughters' futures before they could walk. These weren't informal agreements. They were binding legal contracts with severe financial penalties for breaking them. Then came the child brides at actual ceremonies. Picture this: a 6-year-old girl dressed in elaborate wedding finery, standing next to a man old enough to be her grandfather, while priests blessed their union and called it holy. The visual horror of children at altars, unable to even understand the vows they're repeating, while adults celebrated around them. Finally came the physical horror consummation and pregnancy, in bodies completely unprepared for either. The damage was catastrophic, and often fatal. What were the drivers behind this systematic destruction of childhood? Political alliances drove much of it. Kingdoms rose and fell, based on marriage contracts, and waiting for children to grow up was seen as risking valuable opportunities. If your rival married their 6-year-old daughter to a powerful duke, you'd better marry your 5-year-old to a king. The economic reality was equally brutal. Dowries represented intergenerational wealth transfer, with families viewing daughters as investment vehicles rather than human beings. The younger the bride, the more years of potential childbearing, which meant more valuable heirs. The church didn't just allow this, they actively sanctified it. Theological arguments were crafted to justify child marriage, with priests arguing that early marriage prevented sin and ensured virtue. They had elaborate theological justifications for why a 7-year-old could make a binding lifetime commitment. The scope is staggering. Historians estimate that 40% of noble marriages involved at least one partner under the age of 15. This wasn't a rare occurrence or a few bad actors. This was standard operating procedure for the entire noble class across Europe. Contemporary critics did exist. We have documents from medieval writers calling these practices barbaric. But they were drowned out by the vast majority who saw nothing wrong with trading children like property. One 14th-century Italian merchant wrote in his diary, "Secured an excellent match for little Katharina today. She is but 5, but the boy's family owns 3 ships. She cried when told, but children know not what is best for them." Makes you appreciate age of consent laws, doesn't it? Today, we have entire legal frameworks designed to protect children from predators. Medieval society had legal frameworks designed to deliver children to predators. We consider it a crime to sexualize children in any way. They considered it a sacrament to marry them off before they lost their baby teeth. But here's the truly sick part. The wedding night was just the beginning of the nightmare. Because medieval society didn't just watch these children get married, they made sure the marriage was completed in the most disturbing way possible. If you thought child brides were disturbing, wait until you hear about the bedding ceremony, medieval society's version of sexual performance art. Imagine your wedding night. Now imagine your entire family, your new in-laws, and half the village are not just aware it's happening, they're active participants. Today we cringe at parents asking when you'll have kids. Medieval parents literally escorted you to bed and waited outside for proof. This wasn't just embarrassing. Failure to perform could dissolve kingdoms. The bedding ritual was a carefully choreographed nightmare that would violate every concept of privacy and dignity we hold today. Here's how it worked, and every detail is documented in historical sources. After the wedding feast, the bride and groom would be surrounded by wedding guests who would literally strip them naked. Yes, you heard that right. Your new mother-in-law, your cousins, the local priest, all participated in removing your clothes while making crude jokes and offering advice for the night ahead. The historical accounts describe raucous laughter, sexual encouragement that would make modern audiences blush, and absolutely zero consideration for the couple's comfort or consent. They would then escort the naked couple to the bedchamber, blessing the bed with holy water and prayers for fertility. But wait, it gets worse. The stocking ritual added another layer of public humiliation. Guests would throw the couple's stockings at them while they lay in bed, and whoever's stocking landed on their intended target first would supposedly be the next to marry. Imagine lying naked in bed with your new spouse, while 20 relatives play games with your underwear. The crude jokes and sexual commentary continued throughout, with guests offering increasingly explicit suggestions for ensuring conception. One documented account from a 1487 wedding describes guests shouting encouragement that would be considered sexual harassment today, while the teenage bride wept in embarrassment. Here's what most people don't realize. For royal marriages, witnesses didn't just escort you to bed, they stayed in the room. The political necessity of verified consummation meant that high-ranking marriages often required witnesses to remain present during the act itself. These weren't medical professionals or discreet observers, These were courtiers, relatives, and church officials who needed to verify that the marriage was properly consummated. The pressure to perform under these circumstances was catastrophic. Imagine trying to be intimate while knowing that the Duke of Burgundy is standing 6 feet away, waiting to report back to the king. The case of Catherine of Aragon demonstrates how these witnessed consummations could determine the fate of nations. Her marriage to Prince Arthur required verification of consummation because it affected the succession to the English throne. When Arthur died and Henry VIII wanted to marry her, the entire case hinged on whether the teenage marriage had been consummated. Catherine claimed it hadn't been, but there were no reliable witnesses because the protocol hadn't been properly followed. This lack of witnessed consummation enabled Henry VIII's eventual annulment and break with the Catholic Church. The entire English Reformation arguably happened because teenagers didn't have sex while enough people were watching. The public pressure extended beyond the bedroom. Crowds would gather outside the bedchamber, making noise to encourage the couple. They banged pots, sang bawdy songs, and shouted crude encouragements. The historical records describe scenes that sound more like public executions than romantic encounters. The morning after brought fresh humiliation with the inspection of the sheets. The bloodied linens would be displayed publicly as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. Failure to produce bloody sheets could result in annulment, social disgrace, and even accusations of fraud. Women who didn't bleed, which modern medicine tells us is completely normal, faced devastating consequences. The escalation of invasion went from family participation to complete public spectacle. What started as relatives helping prepare the couple became entire communities demanding proof of sexual completion. Noble families turned intimate moments into political theatre. The church transformed private acts into public sacraments requiring verification. By the late medieval period, some regions had professional witnesses whose job was to verify consummations for important marriages. Imagine that job title on a resume. Why did this insanity become standard practice? The legal framework of medieval marriage required consummation for validity. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled, destroying political alliances and invalidating property transfers. The stakes were so high that privacy became impossible. Political alliances worth kingdoms depended on whether two teenagers successfully had sex. The virgin mythology added another layer of complexity. The bleeding that proved virginity was misunderstood medical nonsense, but it became a cornerstone of marriage validity. Women faced impossible pressure to bleed on command, leading to documented cases of fake blood being smuggled into bedchambers. The power dynamics were brutally unequal. Men faced performance pressure that could end dynasties, while women faced virginity pressure that could end their lives. One young groom's inability to perform on his wedding night led to an annulment that sparked a minor war. A young bride's failure to bleed led to her being returned to her family in disgrace, her father losing the dowry and his political position. The scope was universal. Every noble marriage included some version of public bedding. Even merchant-class weddings adopted similar customs, though usually without witnesses in the actual room. The practice was so normalized that wedding planning included deciding who would strip the couple and who would inspect the sheets. Makes you grateful for hotel honeymoons, doesn't it? Today, what happens in the bedroom stays in the bedroom. Medieval couples performed for an audience that included their parents, their priests, and potentially their political enemies. We consider sexual privacy a basic human right. They considered sexual verification a social necessity. But surviving the wedding night was just the beginning, because medieval wives faced a 33% chance of death with every pregnancy. And in medieval times, pregnancy wasn't a choice. It was a death sentence, dealt out 8 to 15 times per marriage. Forget everything you know about the miracle of childbirth. In medieval times, it was more like spinning a wheel of death. 1 in 3 women died in childbirth. Those aren't odds, that's a massacre. Today's maternal mortality rate is 0.017%. Medieval women faced 33%. That's like comparing a paper cut to a chainsaw. Every medieval pregnancy was literally gambling with your life, and the house always won eventually. Let's return to Margaret Beaufort to understand the true horror of medieval childbirth. At 13 years old, her body simply wasn't designed for what it endured. Contemporary accounts describe a labor that lasted 3 days. 3 days of a child's body trying to deliver a baby. The damage was catastrophic and permanent. She never conceived again despite remarrying twice and living to age 68. Witnesses described the delivery in terms that would traumatize modern readers. Phrases like torn asunder and miracle of survival appear in the records. The baby who survived this traumatic birth would become Henry VII, but at the cost of his mother's fertility and nearly her life. Imagine being permanently damaged at 13 because grown men decided you were ready for motherhood. The statistics are staggering when you truly grasp their meaning. A 33% maternal mortality rate means that in a room with 3 pregnant women, one would die. Not might die, would die. The average noblewoman endured 8 to 15 pregnancies during her marriage. Do the mathematics of terror, with each pregnancy carrying a 1 in 3 chance of death. Survival became statistically impossible. It wasn't a question of if pregnancy would kill you, but which pregnancy would be the fatal one. Women wrote their wills when they discovered they were pregnant. They said goodbye to their children each time, knowing this might be the last. The compound risk meant that women who survived 10 pregnancies had beaten odds that would make winning the lottery look probable. Philippa of Lancaster exemplifies this grinding destruction of women's bodies. 9 pregnancies in 10 years. Her body barely recovered from one before the next began. Contemporary accounts describe her declining health with each birth, her body literally wearing out from the constant strain. She aged decades in those 10 years, going from a vibrant young woman to an exhausted shadow. The 9th pregnancy killed her, leaving 6 surviving children motherless. Her eldest daughter was only 10 years old when she watched her mother die, from the same condition that would likely kill her too. The cycle of reproductive death passed from mother to daughter like a cursed inheritance. The medical help available made things worse rather than better. Midwives operated on superstition and tradition rather than medical knowledge. They had no understanding of infection, hemorrhage, or basic anatomy. Common practices included bloodletting during labor, applying blessed objects to encourage delivery, using herbal concoctions that often caused more harm than help, and praying as the primary medical intervention. When complications arose, and they arose frequently, the response was more prayer, more bloodletting, and eventually, last rites. Women died from conditions that modern medicine resolves in minutes, screaming for help that couldn't come because the knowledge didn't exist. The biological reality was brutal beyond description. Young bodies weren't developed enough for safe childbirth, but girls were married and impregnated anyway. Malnutrition was common even among nobles, weakening bodies further. Previous traumatic births caused permanent damage that made subsequent pregnancies more dangerous. But here's the truly disturbing part. Every woman knew these statistics. They watched their mothers, sisters, and friends die in childbirth. They attended the funerals of women killed by pregnancy. Yet they had no choice but to face the same fate. No birth control existed beyond ineffective folk remedies and prayer. Every sexual encounter could result in pregnancy, and wives had no right to refuse their husbands. The church condemned any attempt to prevent pregnancy as sinful. Women faced a terrible equation: submit to their husbands and risk death, or refuse and face legal punishment, social ostracism, and potential violence. The pressure for male heirs drove this reproductive roulette. A woman who only produced daughters faced blame and possibly replacement. The need for that precious male heir justified endless pregnancies, regardless of the woman's health or survival chances. Medical ignorance turned treatable conditions into death sentences. Breech births, which modern medicine handles routinely, were almost always fatal. Hemorrhaging, treatable with basic modern techniques, meant certain death. Infections from unsterile conditions killed countless women days after surviving the birth itself. The childbed fever that claimed so many was simply infection from unwashed hands and instruments, but without germ theory, no one understood why women kept dying. They blamed everything from sin to planetary alignments, while the real killers, bacteria, and ignorance, went unrecognized. Social acceptance of this carnage remains perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Death in childbirth was seen as God's will, or woman's curse for Eve's sin. The church taught that suffering in childbirth was divinely ordained punishment. Men remarried quickly after their wives died, birthing their children, often impregnating new teenage brides within months. The dead women were forgotten, replaced by fresh victims for the reproductive meat grinder. Their children, if they survived, were raised by stepmothers who faced the same lethal lottery. Modern medicine turned childbirth from Russian roulette into a manageable medical event. Today, dying in childbirth is a tragic rarity. Medieval women faced those odds with every single pregnancy. We have prenatal care, sterile delivery rooms, and medical interventions. They had dirty hands, superstition, and prayer. We choose when and if to have children. They faced pregnancy as an inevitable death sentence, but at least pregnancy was a natural death. Some medieval husbands preferred more direct methods, because when medieval law said, "Till death do us part," sometimes the husband decided when that death would occur. Here's a fun medieval fact. Husbands had government-approved methods for disciplining wives, including death. The rule of thumb literally meant the maximum legal thickness for a wife-beating stick. Today, domestic violence is a crime. Medieval times? It was a handbook. Marriage didn't just risk death in childbirth, it legalized murder. The rule of thumb law represents medieval justice at its most disturbing. Contrary to popular myth-busting, historical records confirm that many jurisdictions did indeed specify the maximum thickness of stick a husband could use to beat his wife. Court documents from 13th century England reference cases where husbands were censured, not for beating their wives, but for using implements that exceeded legal specifications. One case from 1298 describes a husband brought before magistrates because his rod of correction exceeded the width of a man's thumb, causing damage beyond reasonable chastisement. The court ruled he should use a thinner stick next time. Let that sink in. The legal system's response to domestic violence was to regulate the weapon, not stop the violence. The escalation from correction to murder had legal pathways that would horrify modern audiences. While outright murder was technically illegal, the definition of excessive violence was so broad that killing your wife was remarkably easy to justify. If she was shrewish, disobedient, or failed in wifely duties, violent correction was not just permitted but expected. Death during reasonable chastisement was considered unfortunate, but not criminal. Court records show case after case of husbands who beat their wives to death facing minimal or no consequences because the violence was deemed within his rights as husband and master. Henry VIII transformed wife murder into statecraft, creating legal frameworks that made executing wives a royal prerogative. Anne Boleyn's death warrant for treason was actually for alleged adultery, because a queen's adultery was legally defined as treason against the king. Think about that logic. A woman having an affair was equivalent to plotting against the nation. The charges against Anne were fabricated, the trial a sham, but the legal framework made her execution perfectly lawful. She was beheaded at age 35 for crimes she didn't commit, using laws specifically crafted to make killing wives legal. Catherine Howard's fate was even more disturbing, executed at just 19 years old. Her crime was having sexual relationships before marriage and possibly during, though evidence was sketchy at best. The Treason Act of 1534 made it high treason for a queen to commit adultery or to conceal her sexual history before marriage. Catherine, barely out of her teens, was killed for being young and naive in a court that sexualized her from childhood. The night before her execution, she practiced laying her head on the block, trying to die with dignity. These weren't just personal tragedies, they were legal murders sanctioned by Parliament and blessed by the Church. The double standard in punishment reveals the systemic nature of legalized femicide. When wives killed husbands, it wasn't just murder, it was petty treason, punishable by burning at the stake. While men who killed wives might hang if convicted, women who killed husbands burned alive. The legal reasoning was that a wife killing her husband was equivalent to a subject killing their king, an act against the natural order requiring exceptional punishment. Court records detail women burned alive for poisoning abusive husbands who had beaten them for years. One case from 1531 describes Alice Glaston, who poisoned her husband after decades of documented abuse. She burned while he was posthumously exonerated of any wrongdoing. The concept of honor killings existed throughout medieval Europe, though not always called by that name. A husband who discovered his wife's adultery could kill her in the act and face minimal legal consequences. Crime of passion defenses almost always succeeded when men killed wives, but never when wives killed husbands. The church often supported these murders through theological justifications about maintaining household order and male authority. Priests would grant absolution to men who killed adulterous wives, while condemning women who defended themselves against violent husbands. Beyond direct murder, the law enabled indirect killing through neglect and abuse. Husbands controlled all resources, including food and medical care. Starving a disobedient wife wasn't considered criminal. It was household management. Denying medical care during illness or after beatings was within a husband's rights. Women died from treatable conditions because their husbands decided they weren't worth the expense of calling a physician. These deaths weren't investigated or punished. They were just part of marriage. The escalation pattern shows how normalized violence created pathways to murder. It started with legal beating for correction, progressed to severe violence for serious disobedience, advanced to life-threatening abuse for unwifely conduct, and culminated in death, labeled as unfortunate but justified. Each step was legal, each escalation supported by law and custom. The accumulated effect was a society where murdering your wife was often easier than divorcing her. The scope of legalized violence against wives was universal across medieval Europe. Every legal code included provisions for husbands to discipline wives. Every court system showed bias toward husbands in violence cases. Every social structure reinforced male authority through potential violence. Women lived under constant threat of legally sanctioned harm. The bedroom, the home, the marriage itself, all were potential sites of legal murder. Contemporary accounts show some recognized the horror. A few medieval writers condemned excessive violence against wives, but they were voices in the wilderness. The vast majority of society accepted wife-beating and occasional wife-killing as natural parts of marriage. The phrase, "kill your wife," appears disturbingly often in medieval court records, usually in contexts where it was deemed justified or understandable. Makes you appreciate restraining orders and women's shelters, doesn't it? Today, domestic violence is criminal, and resources exist for victims. Medieval wives had nowhere to run and no legal recourse. We recognize intimate partner violence as abuse. They recognized it as a husband's right. But physical death was merciful compared to the civil death women experienced, because the moment a medieval woman said, "I do," she ceased to exist as a legal person. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering you legally no longer exist. Can't sign your name, own property, or make any decision without permission. It's like becoming a ghost who's somehow still expected to have babies. Medieval marriage didn't just change women's names, it erased their existence. The legal doctrine of coverture meant that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was completely absorbed by her husband's. She became a femme covert, a covered woman, which sounds protective until you understand it meant covered, like a corpse is covered, hidden from legal sight. Here's what this meant in practical terms. She couldn't sign contracts, meaning no business dealings whatsoever, couldn't own property in her own name, everything transferred to her husband, couldn't sue or be sued without her husband's participation, couldn't make a will without her husband's permission, couldn't testify in court without her husband's consent. She literally ceased to exist as a separate legal entity. In the eyes of the law, there was only the husband. The property transfer upon marriage was total and irrevocable. Whatever a woman owned before marriage, land, money, goods, even clothes, became her husband's property instantly. The dowry her family scraped together to secure her marriage? His. The inheritance from her dead parents? His. The jewelry her grandmother left specifically to her? His. He could sell it, gamble it away, give it to his mistress, and she had zero legal recourse. Contemporary documents show women watching helplessly as husbands sold their ancestral lands to pay gambling debts. One particularly heartbreaking case from 1423 describes Lady Margaret Howick watching her husband sell her childhood home, inherited from her father, to pay for his failed military campaign. She couldn't even protest in court because she didn't legally exist. The daily humiliations of non-existence ground women down systematically. Need to leave the house? Ask your husband's permission. Want to visit your dying mother? Only if he allows it. Think your children should learn to read? Too bad. Education decisions belong to fathers alone. Your husband decides your clothing too fine and you're vain. too simple and you're embarrassing him. He controls what you eat, when you sleep, who you see. One medieval conduct manual advises husbands to govern their wives as they would children or servants, with firm but fair discipline. Women went from their father's control to their husbands with no moment of personal autonomy. The children you risked your life birthing? Legally, they belonged only to your husband. If he died, his family could take them from you. If he decided to send your 6-year-old daughter to marry some foreign duke, you had no say. If he wanted to place your son in a monastery at age 7, your protests meant nothing. Mothers watched their children distributed like property because legally, that's what they were, the father's property. The emotional torture of having no say in your children's lives while being expected to love and care for them created psychological damage we can barely comprehend. The escalation of erasure followed a predictable pattern. Financial control led to complete economic dependence. Legal invisibility led to social powerlessness. Personal autonomy disappeared into household imprisonment. The end result was complete absorption into your husband's identity. You became an extension of him rather than a person yourself. Medieval documents rarely record women's opinions because legally, they couldn't have opinions that mattered. The philosophy behind coverture revealed medieval society's fundamental view of women as perpetual children. The legal reasoning went, women were too emotional for business, too weak for property ownership, too simple for legal matters, and needed male protection and guidance. Never mind that widows suddenly became capable of all these things the moment their husbands died. The system wasn't about protection, it was about control. By making women legally invisible, society ensured they could never challenge male authority. Economic control guaranteed women couldn't escape abusive marriages. With no money, no property, and no legal right to earn wages, where could they go? Returning to their birth, families brought shame, and often wasn't possible. Their families had paid dowries specifically to get rid of them. The church offered no sanctuary. They preached wifely submission as divine will. The only escape from marriage was death, yours or his. The scope was absolute. Every married woman, from queens to peasants, experienced some version of legal erasure. Queens might maintain ceremonial roles, but their husbands controlled their wealth and decisions. Noble ladies might influence through persuasion, but held no actual power. Common women disappeared entirely into their husbands' identities. The universality of female legal non-existence makes it one of history's most successful systems of oppression. Today, women are CEOs. Medieval women couldn't own a chicken. Modern women have bank accounts, sign contracts, run businesses. Medieval women needed their husband's permission to give charity from their own inherited wealth. We take female legal personhood for granted. They lived in a world where marriage meant civil death. Speaking of financial disasters, let's talk about the cost of buying a wife, because medieval families literally bankrupted themselves for the privilege of giving their daughters away. Think student loans are bad? Medieval families destroyed their finances for generations to afford one wedding. We're talking the medieval equivalent of $500,000 for the privilege of giving your daughter away. Today's average wedding costs $30,000. Medieval dowries could buy entire villages. Families faced a choice: financial ruin or social destruction. The mathematics of dowry destruction would make modern financial advisors weep. Let's examine specific historical examples with their modern equivalents calculated. The 1469 marriage of Margaret of York to Charles the Bold of Burgundy required a dowry of 200,000 gold crowns, approximately $15 million in today's money. This for one wedding. England nearly bankrupted itself, paying for this single marriage alliance. Tax records show new levies created specifically to fund this dowry, meaning regular English citizens paid for a princess to marry a foreign duke. The economic impact lasted decades. But that's just the extreme example. Even minor noble families faced financial catastrophe. The Paston Letters, a collection of 15th century correspondence, detail a middle-ranking English family's dowry negotiations. For their daughter Margaret, they offered 200 marks, plus her clothing, jewellery and household goods. This represented more than 5 years of the family's entire income. They mortgaged lands that had been in the family for centuries, borrowed from Italian bankers at crushing interest rates, and sold off livestock and timber rights, all for one daughter's marriage. And they had 3 more daughters to marry off. The Gonzaga family of Mantua provides a stark example of cumulative dowry destruction. With 6 daughters to marry between 1450 and 1480, they paid out dowries totaling the equivalent of $50 million in modern money. Each successive daughter cost more as dowry inflation spiraled out of control. By the time they married off the youngest, they had sold 3 castles, mortgaged their entire agricultural output for 20 years, and borrowed from every banking house in northern Italy. The family never recovered financially. Their letters discuss selling art treasures and dismissing servants to afford bread. Here's the truly insane part: dowries were non-refundable. If your daughter died a week after the wedding, her husband kept the money. If he divorced her, he kept the money. If he turned out to be abusive and she fled home, he kept the money. The Medici bank records show dozens of cases where families paid enormous dowries only to have their daughters die in childbirth within a year. The husband would immediately remarry, collecting another dowry, while the first family remained bankrupt. It was a financial scam of epic proportions, but completely legal and socially required. The economic system behind dowries created generational poverty. Families borrowed against future income, mortgaging their children's inheritances to marry off daughters. Sons couldn't inherit intact estates because their sisters' dowries had carved them up. The pressure to provide competitive dowries led to an inflationary spiral. If your neighbor offered 100 marks, you needed to offer 120, or your daughter would never marry. Venice actually passed laws trying to cap dowry amounts because families were destroying themselves trying to outbid each other. Social pressure made this financial suicide mandatory. An unmarried daughter was a family shame, a burden who would live at home forever, mocked by society. The alternative to marriage was the convent, which also required a dowry payment, though usually smaller. Families literally paid to get rid of their daughters one way or another. The few women who remained unmarried faced lives of dependency and humiliation, constant reminders of their family's failure to secure marriages. The competition for suitable husbands drove dowry inflation to insane levels. Since women couldn't inherit titles or run estates, families needed to marry daughters to men who could provide for them. This created a seller's market where eligible bachelors could demand astronomical dowries. One Duke of Norfolk received marriage proposals for his infant son that included dowry offers exceeding the annual income of entire counties. Families bid against each other like some twisted auction where the prize was getting rid of your daughter. The convent alternative wasn't much better financially. While convent dowries were typically 1/3 to 1/2 of marriage dowries, they still represented substantial sums. Plus, unlike marriage where the daughter might eventually inherit from her husband, convent dowries were gone forever. The daughter became dead to the world, unable to return, even if the family's circumstances changed. Venice's convents filled with noblemen's daughters whose families couldn't afford full marriage dowries. One contemporary called them dumping grounds for the unmarriageable. The scope of financial destruction touched every family with daughters. Tax records from across medieval Europe show families selling ancestral lands, taking ruinous loans, and liquidating assets to afford dowries. Florentine bank records from the 15th century show that dowry loans constituted one of the largest categories of private debt. The Dottini banking house correspondence discusses dozens of families ruined by dowry payments, unable to recover even generations later. Makes you appreciate splitting the dinner check on dates, doesn't it? Modern weddings might be expensive, but they don't require selling your ancestral home. Today's parents might contribute to weddings, but they don't mortgage their entire futures. We see large weddings as optional excess. Medieval families saw large dowries as mandatory expenses that determined their daughters' entire futures. But at least modern marriages, last medieval marriages, had expiration dates. Because in medieval times, till death do us part, wasn't a promise, it was a timeline. In medieval times, there was only one way out of a bad marriage, and it usually arrived within 15 years. Death wasn't the end of marriage, it was the expected conclusion. Today we have divorce lawyers. Medieval people had the Black Death. Every marriage was temporary, every widow was marriage material, and everyone was planning for death. The statistics paint a grim picture of marital longevity. The average medieval marriage lasted just 15 years before one spouse died. Not from old age, from childbirth, plague, infected wounds, dysentery, smallpox, or any of 1,000 other killers that modern medicine prevents. When you said, "Till death do us part," you were making a 15-year commitment maximum. Wedding guests who heard those vows knew they'd likely attend at least one of the spouse's funerals within 2 decades. Some attended both. The Black Death transformed marriage from a lifetime commitment into a game of musical chairs with graves. When the plague killed 1/3 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, it didn't discriminate between newlyweds and long-married couples. Carefully negotiated marriage alliances collapsed overnight as entire families died. The chronicles of Jean Froissart describe nobles arriving for weddings to discover the bride, groom, or both had died days before. One particularly macabre account tells of a wedding feast that became a mass funeral when plague struck the gathering by week's end. Both families were extinct. The aftermath created a remarriage frenzy that would seem callous by modern standards. Widowers remarried within months, sometimes weeks. The practical necessities, someone to run the household, care for surviving children, maintain social position, outweighed any notion of mourning. Widows, if they survived childbirth and plague, became the most sought-after marriage prospects. They brought their first husband's wealth, proven fertility, and household experience. The unseemly haste of remarriage shocked no one. A London merchant's diary from 1348 records matter-of-factly, "Buried my wife Margaret yesterday. Must seek new wife soon as children need mother, and household needs managing." The parallels between weddings and funerals in medieval society reveal death's constant presence. The same priest who performed your marriage would likely perform your funeral. The same church that witnessed your vows would hold your burial service. Wedding prayers, explicitly included, preparation for death couples, were reminded during the ceremony that they would answer to God for their marriage vows soon enough. One surviving marriage liturgy includes the chilling phrase, "As death will soon part thee, prepare thy souls for judgment." Imagine modern wedding vows including reminders of your imminent mortality. The children from these serial marriages created complex family structures that make modern blended families look simple. A typical noble household might include children from the husband's first marriage, children from the wife's previous marriage, children from their current union, and orphaned relatives from plague-dead family members. Step-siblings, half-siblings, and temporary siblings created inheritance nightmares. One legal document from 1389 attempts to sort out an inheritance between 17 children from one man's 4 marriages. He outlived all 4 wives. Remarriage speed defied modern sensibilities about grief and propriety. Widowers with young children might remarry before their wives' graves had settled. The Duke of Berry buried his wife in January 1388 and married again in June. The Count of Flanders lost 3 wives to childbirth in 7 years, marrying again within 3 months each time. Women faced similar pressure. A widow with property needed protection, and remarriage provided it. The concept of a mourning period existed but was routinely ignored for practical reasons. The mortality reality shaped every aspect of medieval marriage. Average life expectancy of 35 years meant that marrying at 15 gave you maybe 20 years together, if you were extraordinarily lucky. But women's death rate in childbirth and men's in warfare or accident meant most marriages ended much sooner. Every pregnancy risked orphaning existing children. Every military campaign risked widowing wives. Every fever or infection could end a marriage overnight. People didn't plan golden anniversaries. They planned for inevitable widowhood. The economic necessity drove remarriage patterns that seem mercenary today. A widow's property made her valuable regardless of age or appearance. A 50-year-old widow with good lands might marry a 20-year-old man who needed wealth. A widower with young children would marry any available woman who could manage his household. Love, compatibility, or attraction rarely entered the equation. These were business mergers between the living and the assets of the dead. The religious framework provided the only constant in this mortality chaos. The Church taught that marriage bonds dissolved at death, freeing survivors to remarry. But they also preached that excessive mourning showed lack of faith. The dead were with God, and the living must continue. This convenient theology enabled rapid remarriage while maintaining moral authority. Priests who condemned vanity would bless a 4th marriage without irony. Today we mourn for years. Medieval people mourned for weeks. We consider finding new love after loss a lengthy process requiring emotional healing. They considered finding new spouses an urgent practical necessity. We keep photos and memories of dead spouses. They erased them through immediate replacement. We have grief counseling and support groups. They had new wedding plans before the funeral feast ended. Which brings us full circle to our starting point. Remember that 6-year-old with her dolls at her wedding? She faced every single nightmare we've discussed. Married as a child to seal political alliances, subjected to public bedding ceremonies before she understood what marriage meant. She'd face pregnancy after pregnancy, each one potentially fatal, while losing all legal rights to exist as a person. Her family bankrupted themselves to provide her dowry, money she'd never see again. If she survived the average 8 to 10 pregnancies, she might live to see her husband take a younger wife. If not, her children would get a stepmother within months of her death. She'd watch friends die in childbirth, see relatives burned for defending themselves against abusive husbands, know that her own daughters would face the same fate. This wasn't rare. This was every medieval noblewoman's expected life path. The most disturbing part? Everyone involved thought this was normal, moral, and blessed by God. The priests who married 6-year-olds, the parents who bankrupted themselves for dowries, the witnesses who verified consummations, all believed they were doing right. The entire structure of society, from law to religion to economics, supported and enforced these practices. Critics existed, but were dismissed as radicals or heretics. The system persisted for centuries, not despite its horror, but because people accepted horror as tradition. What does this tell us about human nature? We're capable of normalizing almost anything if society tells us it's proper. Medieval people weren't uniquely cruel. They followed their culture's rules just as we follow ours. The practices that horrify us were considered moral necessities. The suffering we recognize was invisible to them, hidden behind tradition and theology. Every generation believes its normal is natural, its customs moral, its traditions justified. But we proved society can change. The horrors we've discussed didn't end because of some sudden moral awakening. They ended through centuries of struggle, reform, and recognition that tradition isn't justification for suffering. Legal personhood for women, medical advances in childbirth, marriage based on consent and choice, these aren't inevitable human developments. They're hard-won victories against systems that seemed as permanent as stone castles. This historical mirror should make us question our own normalized horrors. What practices do we accept that future generations will condemn? What suffering do we ignore because that's how things are? What traditions do we defend that cause systematic harm? Medieval people couldn't imagine marriage without ownership, pregnancy without death risk, or women as legal persons. What can't we imagine that should be obvious? Next time you complain about dating apps, remember medieval marriage markets where 6-year-olds were traded like livestock. When modern relationships frustrate you, remember women who couldn't own property or refuse their husbands. When you worry about finding the one, be grateful you get to choose at all. You can marry for love, divorce if needed, control your own money, survive childbirth, and exist as a legal person. Your worst relationship problem is paradise compared to medieval marriage's best day. You live in an era where love is possible, choice exists, and marriage doesn't mean death, physical, legal, or civil. That's not natural or inevitable. That's the result of centuries of people refusing to accept horror as tradition. So while medieval marriage shows humanity at its worst, our distance from it shows we're capable of better. Not perfect, but better. And that's worth remembering next time someone romanticizes the good old days. If this video disturbed you, good. Hit subscribe for more hidden historical horrors the textbooks don't teach. Comment below. Which medieval marriage practice shocked you most? Share this with someone who thinks they were born in the wrong era. Cure them of that delusion fast. Next video, medieval justice system. Spoiler, it makes marriage look merciful. Until then, go hug your spouse. Thank your lucky stars you live now. And never, ever romanticize the past.